It was 11:52 p.m., and the fluorescent lights of the industrial facility hummed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the labyrinth of machinery. Darren adjusted his uniform cap, squinting at the long rows of equipment ahead. This was his first night as a security guard for Arcadia Processing Plant, a massive, almost forgotten relic on the outskirts of town. Easy gig, his supervisor had promised. Just make the rounds, check the cameras, and stay awake. The place is basically dead at night. The word dead echoed in Darren's mind as he signed into the logbook at the security desk. The building, a hulking structure with cavernous ceilings, felt abandoned even during the day, let alone during the night shift. Rumors floated among the employees that strange things happened here after hours. Most brushed it off as urban legend, but Darren had overheard snippets of conversation in the break room, missing items, unexplainable noises, and once, a worker who refused to talk about why he quit. Stupid stories, Darren muttered under his breath, pulling out his flashlight. The first part of his shift went uneventfully. Darren patrolled the perimeter, his boots echoing on the cold concrete floors. The only sounds were the rhythmic clicking of an old clock near the manager's office and the occasional distant groan of settling metal. He checked each section meticulously, as instructed, the machine bay, the storage room, and the control station. Everything seemed fine. Boring, even. By 2:30 a.m., Darren returned to the security desk to review the camera footage. He cycled through each of the monitors, most showing empty hallways or dormant machinery. But as he flipped to camera 7, which covered the old loading dock, he froze. There was movement, a shadow slipping just out of frame. He rewound the footage. The playback showed the same thing, a dark, humanoid shape darting just beyond the camera's edge. Darren leaned in closer, his pulse quickening. Was it a glitch? A trick of the light? Or was someone inside the building? Grabbing his flashlight and walkie-talkie, Darren made his way to the loading dock. The air felt heavier here, colder somehow, even though the building's temperature should have been consistent. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the cavernous space, illuminating piles of pallets, stacks of boxes, and empty steel shelves. Nothing seemed out of place. "Hello?" Darren called, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Anyone here?" Silence answered him. He exhaled, trying to steady his nerves, and turned to head back. That's when he heard it, the faintest sound of something scraping against metal. He whipped around, shining his flashlight toward the noise. For a split second, he thought he saw movement near the far end of the dock, but when he aimed the beam directly at it, there was nothing. Just shadows. Darren's heart raced as he scanned the room again. He reminded himself that he was alone, at least, he should be. But the sensation that someone, or something, was watching him was almost overwhelming. "Pull it together, man," he whispered to himself. He decided to chalk it up to paranoia and headed back to the desk. Yet as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows themselves were shifting, stretching, as if alive. By 3:15 a.m., Darren was back at the desk, staring at the monitors with a mixture of dread and determination. Camera 7 showed nothing now, just the static emptiness of the loading dock. He flipped through the feeds again, and this time, something new caught his eye. On camera 3, overlooking the machine bay, one of the massive conveyor belts was moving. Darren frowned. He was certain all equipment had been powered down hours ago. Grabbing his walkie-talkie, he radioed dispatch. "Base, this is Darren at Arcadia. Do we have any authorized personnel scheduled to be on site tonight?" Over. A burst of static followed before the reply came, "Negative, Darren. You're the only one on shift. Everything okay?" Over. Darren hesitated. Should he mention the moving conveyor belt? The shadow? He decided against it. The last thing he needed was to come across as jumpy on his first shift. "Copy that. Everything's fine. Over and out." He didn't feel fine. Returning to the machine bay, Darren found the conveyor belt still running, its mechanical hum filling the space. He inspected the control panel, which was lit up despite the power switch being firmly set to off. Frowning, he flipped the switch, and the conveyor ground to a halt with a metallic screech. That's when he noticed something. In the thin layer of dust covering the surface of the conveyor was a pattern, drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled across it. The marks ended abruptly near the edge of the belt, as if the object had fallen, or been taken, somewhere else. Just, equipment malfunctions, Darren muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. As he turned to leave, his flashlight caught something unusual on the wall. A series of faint, handprint-like smudges marred the otherwise pristine white surface. They were too high to belong to anyone of normal height, and they seemed to taper into long, almost claw-like shapes. By 4:30 a.m., Darren was officially unnerved. He returned to the desk, where the monitors now seemed to mock him with their grainy, flickering images. Every noise, every creak and groan of the building, felt amplified, like a whisper in his ear. He rubbed his temples, counting the hours until sunrise. Just as he started to relax, the power went out. The security monitors blinked off, plunging the desk into darkness. The emergency lights flickered to life a moment later, casting the building in a dim, red haze. Darren grabbed his flashlight, the beam now feeling pitifully inadequate against the oppressive gloom. "Base, this is Darren. We've got a power outage here at Arcadia. Can you confirm if it's localized or system-wide?" "Over." "Static." "Base, do you copy?" "Over." More static. Then, faintly, a voice. But it wasn't the dispatcher. It was a garbled, almost inhuman whisper, repeating something Darren couldn't understand. He dropped the walkie-talkie, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep within the building. Darren stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop just outside the glow of his flashlight. "Who's there?" Darren demanded, his voice breaking. The only response was a low, guttural sound, half growl, half laugh, that sent chills racing down his spine. Slowly, the beam of his flashlight trembled upward, illuminating the source of the sound. It wasn't human. Darren's flashlight beam quivered as it landed on the figure. His breath caught, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the shadowy silhouette in front of him. It stood just within the edge of the light, its body tall and angular, limbs too long to be human. The dim red glow of the emergency lights behind it only added to its unnerving presence. Then it moved. Not a shuffle, not a step, but a fluid glide, as though it were unhindered by the laws of motion. Darren stumbled back, heart pounding, nearly dropping his flashlight. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. The figure halted, cocking its head in an unnatural, almost curious way. Its outline was still shadow-like, but Darren could now make out faint details, a face, or what should have been one. It was smooth, featureless, as if someone had stretched a mask of darkness over a skull. Suddenly, it darted sideways, vanishing into the shadows like smoke dissipating in the wind. "No, no, no," Darren whispered, spinning wildly with the flashlight. His beam slashed through the dark, revealing only the empty space of the machine bay. The sound of footsteps resumed, now echoing in irregular intervals. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, above, below, behind. The flashlight flickered. Panic clawed at Darren's chest. He ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The building's sprawling layout seemed foreign now, the once familiar pathways twisting into an unending maze. His boots slapped against the concrete, the sound amplified by the emptiness around him. He burst into the storage room and slammed the heavy door shut behind him. The room was small, cramped with rows of shelving stacked high with dusty boxes and equipment. Darren pressed his back against the door, struggling to catch his breath. His heart thundered in his chest, and cold sweat slicked his face. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, he thought he was safe. Then he heard it, the soft, deliberate scrape of something dragging across the floor on the other side of the door. Darren squeezed his eyes shut, praying the door would hold. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low whispering, just barely audible. It wasn't a voice, it was a cacophony of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, overlapping and speaking in an unintelligible language that made Darren's skin crawl. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was on the other side wanted him to hear. Darren gritted his teeth, refusing to move. Then, with a sudden, violent crash, something slammed into the door, shaking it on its hinges. Darren yelped, spinning around to brace the door with his body. Another crash followed, then another. Whatever it was trying to get in. He fumbled for his walkie-talkie, gripping it tightly despite the trembling in his hands. Base. This is Darren. I need help now. Something's in the building. I repeat, something's in here with me. The walkie hissed with static, but there was no reply. The pounding on the door intensified, each blow reverberating through the metal. Darren scanned the room, desperate for a way out. His eyes landed on an air vent near the ceiling. It was a tight squeeze, but it might lead him to another section of the facility. Without hesitation, he scrambled up the shelving, his flashlight clattering to the floor as he climbed. The moment he reached the vent, the door burst open. Darren didn't look back. He shoved himself into the vent, his body scraping against the cold metal as he wriggled forward. The whispering was deafening now, an unrelenting chorus of voices that seemed to seep into his mind. He crawled faster, his muscles screaming in protest. Suddenly, the vent ahead of him buckled, and Darren came to a dead stop. He stared, horrified, as the metal warped and twisted, as if something unseen was pressing against it from the outside. A long, claw-like hand punctured through the vent's surface, its fingers impossibly thin and sharp. Darren scrambled backward, kicking wildly. The hand retreated for a moment, only to reappear further down the vent, slashing at the metal. No! Darren shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. Leave me alone. With a desperate burst of adrenaline, he turned and crawled in the opposite direction. The vent opened into a utility room, and Darren tumbled out onto the floor, gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet, slamming the vent cover shut behind him. The utility room was lit by the faint glow of a single emergency light, casting long, distorted shadows over the walls. Darren leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what was happening. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking as he dialed 911. The line rang twice before connecting, but instead of a dispatcher, he heard the same garbled whispering that had haunted him earlier. Darren dropped the phone with a cry, watching as the screen flickered and went dark. The emergency light flickered too, plunging the room into brief moments of total darkness. Each time the light returned, the shadows on the walls seemed to grow, shifting and writhing like living things. Darren grabbed a wrench from a nearby tool bench, holding it tightly like a weapon. Come on, he muttered, his voice trembling. Whatever you are, just come out already. The light flickered again, and this time, it didn't come back. The room was plunged into absolute blackness. Darren's grip on the wrench tightened as he listened intently, straining to hear any sound beyond the pounding of his heart. Then, from the far corner of the room, came a soft, wet gurgle. Darren swung the wrench blindly, the sound of his own movements echoing around him. Stay back, he screamed. I'm armed. The gurgling grew louder, closer, until it was directly in front of him. Darren swung again, but his wrench struck only empty air. A hand clamped around his wrist, cold, bony, and impossibly strong. Darren cried out as the wrench was ripped from his grip. The whispering returned, louder than ever, drowning out his thoughts. And then, he felt it, a second hand on his shoulder, its touch sending a jolt of icy dread through his body. Slowly, the hands began to pull him downward, into the shadows that now seemed to spread across the floor like ink. No! Darren screamed, thrashing wildly. Let me go. His struggles were futile. The darkness enveloped him, the whispers consuming his every thought. And just as he felt himself being dragged into the abyss, the emergency light flickered back on. The room was empty. The room's emptiness was almost more terrifying than the chaos that had consumed it moments before. Darren lay sprawled on the cold concrete, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The wrench he had wielded as a weapon was gone, and his hands, trembling and raw, were empty. It felt like hours had passed, but the clock on the far wall revealed it had been mere minutes. 4:56 a.m. Only a little over an hour until his shift ended, if he could survive that long. Darren pushed himself to his feet, his entire body protesting the effort. He needed to get out of the building. The corridors were silent again, but it was an oppressive silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Darren's neck stand on end. He glanced behind him every few steps, convinced he would see the shadowy figure lurking just out of sight. But the hallways remained empty, the emergency lights casting their ominous red glow over everything. He made his way to the security desk, determined to call for help one last time. As he approached, he stopped short. The monitors were back on, each screen flickering with static. Darren hesitated, then stepped closer, his eyes scanning the feeds. At first, it seemed like nothing was wrong, just the usual empty hallways and rooms. But then, on camera 4, something moved. Darren leaned in, squinting at the screen. The image was grainy, but there was no mistaking the figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was him. Darren stared in disbelief as the figure on the screen mirrored his every move, turning its head to look directly into the camera. His stomach churned. This wasn't a reflection, it couldn't be. The camera was stationary, and there was no glass in that part of the building. The figure raised its hand and pointed, slowly and deliberately, at the camera. Then it began to walk toward it, each step bringing it closer to the lens until its face filled the screen. Darren staggered back, his breath hitching as the figure's featureless face seemed to ripple, the darkness shifting and twisting into a grotesque parody of his own. The screen went black. No, Darren whispered, his voice barely audible. This isn't real. It can't be real. He grabbed the walkie-talkie again, but before he could speak, a voice crackled through the static. Run. It wasn't the dispatcher's voice. It wasn't even human. The distorted, guttural tone sent a shiver down Darren's spine. He dropped the walkie-talkie and bolted. The emergency exits were Darren's only hope. He sprinted down the hallways, his flashlight's beam bouncing wildly as he moved. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, the red lights flickering in and out. Each turn felt like a wrong one, the walls closing in tighter with every step. Finally, he saw it, the glowing green sign of an exit. Relief surged through him as he barreled toward it, slamming into the door with all his weight. But the door didn't budge. Darren fumbled with the handle, twisting and pulling, but it was locked. No, 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 he shouted, pounding on the door. Let me out. Behind him, the whispering returned. Darren froze, his hand still on the handle. The sound was closer now, louder, as if the walls themselves were speaking. He turned slowly, his flashlight cutting through the dim red haze. The hallway was empty. But then he saw it, a shadow stretching along the floor, creeping toward him like ink spreading through water. Darren backed against the door, his breathing shallow. The shadow stopped a few feet away, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then it rose. It wasn't a figure this time. It was an amorphous mass, shifting and writhing, its surface a chaotic swirl of darkness. Faces emerged and dissolved within it, their mouths open in silent screams. Darren's legs buckled, and he slid to the floor, unable to tear his eyes away from the horrifying spectacle. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping and drowning each other out. Darren clapped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. The darkness advanced, inching closer with each passing second. In his desperation, Darren did the only thing he could think of: he closed his eyes and screamed. When he opened them again, the hallway was empty. The whispers were gone, the shadow nowhere to be seen. Darren blinked, his head pounding as he tried to process what had just happened. His body trembled as he pulled himself to his feet. The clock on the wall read 5:43 a.m. Sunrise was less than 20 minutes away. If he could just hold on a little longer, he might make it out of this nightmare alive. He moved cautiously now, his steps slow and deliberate. Every creak of the building, every flicker of light, set his nerves on edge. He avoided the cameras, unable to shake the memory of his distorted doppelganger. Finally, he reached the lobby. The glass doors leading outside were just ahead, the pale glow of dawn visible through the windows. Darren quickened his pace, hope igniting in his chest for the first time all night. That's when he heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the empty space. He froze, turning slowly. At the far end of the lobby stood the figure. Its shape was more defined now, its movement smoother, almost human. But its face, or lack thereof, was the same featureless void. It tilted its head, as if studying him, and then it began to walk forward. Darren didn't wait to see what would happen next. He sprinted for the doors, slamming into them with all his strength. They flew open, and the cool morning air hit his face like a blessing. He stumbled onto the pavement, collapsing to his knees as the first rays of sunlight bathed the facility. He turned back toward the building, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. But there was nothing there, just the empty lobby and the faint hum of machinery. Darren sat there for a long time, his body trembling, as the sun climbed higher into the sky. When the day shift arrived, they found Darren sitting on the curb, his uniform soaked in sweat and his eyes wide with terror. He refused to go back inside, refusing even to explain what had happened. All he could say, over and over, was, "Don't go in there. It's not safe." A week later, Darren quit. Arcadia Processing Plant remained open, its night shifts filled by other unlucky souls. But the rumors persisted, stories of strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and the occasional guard who disappeared without a trace. For Darren, the nightmare never truly ended. Even in the safety of his own home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he would hear it, the faintest sound of whispering. Darren didn't sleep for days after his ordeal at Arcadia. When he closed his eyes, the shadows returned, twisting into impossible shapes that loomed over him. The whispers crept into his dreams, pulling him back to that endless labyrinth of red-lit corridors. Every creak of his apartment floor, every hum of a passing car outside, made him jump. He tried to tell himself it was just trauma, that his mind was playing tricks on him after a stressful night, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. He avoided the phone calls from Arcadia's HR department, who wanted him to formally debrief. What could he possibly say? That the shadows had come alive? That something inhuman had been hunting him? He doubted they would believe him, and worse, he feared they might send him back to the plant. It was on the fifth sleepless night that Darren noticed something unusual in his apartment. He'd been sitting on his couch, staring blankly at the muted television, when a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering effects of his frayed nerves. But then it happened again, longer this time, unmistakable. The shadow wasn't cast by anything in the room. It moved independently, stretching across the wall like ink spreading through water. Darren froze, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow grew darker, more defined, and as he watched, it began to take shape. No, Darren whispered, backing away. Not here. Not again. The whispering started, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves. It grew louder, the overlapping voices merging into a haunting melody that filled the small apartment. Darren clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The whispers weren't just sounds, they were inside his head. The shadow lunged toward him, and Darren scrambled backward, tripping over the coffee table. His phone clattered to the floor, and in his panic, he grabbed it and hit the first number on speed dial, his sister, Melissa. Darren? Melissa's voice was groggy. It was past midnight. What's going on? Help me. Darren shouted, his voice cracking. It's here. It followed me. What? Darren, calm down. What are you talking about? Before he could explain, the phone cut out. The line went dead, replaced by the same static-laced whispers that had haunted him at Arcadia. Darren hurled the phone across the room, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. Melissa arrived at Darren's apartment an hour later, pounding on the door. He let her in, his face pale and drenched in sweat. She gasped at his disheveled state, dark circles under his eyes, trembling hands, and a wild look of terror that seemed etched into his features. Darren, what happened to you? She demanded. He didn't know where to begin. Stammering, he told her about the night shift, the shadows, and the whispers. He described the figure on the monitor, the thing that had chased him, and now how it had followed him home. Melissa listened with a mix of concern and disbelief. You're not making any sense, she said gently. Have you slept at all? Maybe this is just exhaustion. A breakdown from stress. It's not in my head. Darren snapped, his voice rising. It's real, Melissa. I saw it. I heard it. And now it's here. As if to punctuate his words, the lights flickered. Melissa froze, glancing around the room. That's probably just bad wiring, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. No, it's not, Darren whispered. He pointed toward the far corner of the room, where the shadow had reappeared. It's there. Melissa turned, her eyes widening as she saw the darkness shifting unnaturally. What the hell? The whispering returned, louder this time. Melissa backed away, her hands clutching at Darren's arm. What is that? What's happening? I told you. Darren shouted over the rising noise. It followed me. The shadows surged forward, engulfing the room in a suffocating blackness. The whispers reached a crescendo, and Darren and Melissa clung to each other, their terror palpable. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The lights flickered back to life, and the room was empty. Melissa insisted Darren come stay at her house, and he reluctantly agreed. For the next few days, she kept a close eye on him, urging him to eat, sleep, and see a doctor. But Darren was haunted by what he had experienced, and even in the safety of her home, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. One night, as Darren lay awake in the guest room, he noticed something strange about the ceiling. The shadows cast by the street lamp outside didn't seem right. They were too sharp, too deliberate. He sat up, his heart racing, and watched in horror as the shadows began to move, creeping down the walls like living creatures. Melissa! Darren shouted, leaping out of bed. It's here. Melissa burst into the room, her eyes wide with panic. What's wrong? Before Darren could answer, the whispering started again, filling the house with its eerie cadence. Melissa covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. Make it stop. I can't. Darren cried, grabbing her arm. We have to leave. They bolted out of the house, the whispers following them all the way to the car. As they drove aimlessly through the empty streets, Melissa finally broke the silence. What does it want, Darren? Why won't it leave you alone? I don't know, he admitted, his voice trembling. But I think. I think it wants me to go back. Darren realized there was only one way to end this. He had to return to Arcadia. It was the last place he had encountered the entity, and he was convinced it was the source of his torment. Melissa begged him not to go, but Darren's mind was made up. Under the cover of night, they arrived at the processing plant. The building loomed ominously in the darkness, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at them. Darren took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped inside. Melissa followed, clutching a flashlight and muttering prayers under her breath. The air inside was heavy, oppressive. The emergency lights still flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them. Darren led the way, retracing his steps from that fateful night. The whispers started almost immediately, faint and distant at first, but growing louder with each step. They reached the machine bay, where Darren had first seen the claw-like handprints. The marks were still there, etched into the walls like a dark memory. Darren stood in the center of the room, his heart pounding. "All right," he shouted into the emptiness. "I'm here. What do you want from me?" The shadows answered. They swirled around him, a cyclone of darkness and noise. Melissa screamed as the shadows closed in, but Darren stood his ground, refusing to back down. "Why me?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the room. "You belong." Darren's knees buckled as the shadows enveloped him. For a brief moment, he felt weightless, suspended in the void. Then, everything went silent. When Melissa opened her eyes, Darren was gone. The next morning, authorities found Melissa wandering the streets, disoriented and muttering about shadows and whispers. She was taken to a hospital for evaluation, but Darren was never found. Arcadia processing plant shut down shortly after, citing unexplained incidents as the reason. The building now stands abandoned, a place of whispers and shadows that no one dares to enter. But on quiet nights, if you stand close enough, you can still hear it, the faint sound of Darren's voice, calling out from the void.